What's up, photographers? Welcome back to the studio. Today we're going to talk about exposure. Now, as we start to kind of pick apart what it is about a good photograph that sort of catches your eye, maybe difficult to explain, but you kind of know it when you see it, we'll do a couple of technical photographic experiments to sort of not only kind of learn about what photographers have used for a very long time to sort of master their craft, but also practice some of the stuff and see what your camera is capable of, see what happens when you approach these assignments from a couple different angles. So this kind of set of assignments will take place over the course of probably 3 tutorials, and each one is going to sort of ratchet up the level of complexity of the assignment. If you're going to kind of start thinking about how to get a good exposure, people just about always think, that's something that happens in post, or what you might consider, say, working in Photoshop. But if we kind of hit the brakes on doing post-production work and rewind this a little bit and think about what's going on in the actual shoot itself, what about in camera? Is there anything going on in the camera that we might have some control over that we could actually use to help get a better exposure? And then finally, if we really back this up all the way, we could think about it in terms of our studio lighting situation. And right now we're going to do some work in the studio, but let's just say, for example, you're not in a studio, you're somewhere else. You could just as easily kind of think of studio lighting in terms of environmental lighting. It could be the sun, it could be bounce light, reflected light, could be kind of a mixture of natural and artificial lighting. But just kind of to keep it simple for this project, let's just sort of think in terms of our studio lighting setup. Now, obviously, a good exposure is going to be kind of a magical mixture of each one of these things, kind of carefully figuring out what's going on with your lighting, making sure you have your camera set up correctly, and then we can kind of set us up really nicely for some good edits in post-production. But we're going to break these into 3 specific assignments, and then if in the end we come together with some sort of magical, holy combination of both, well, awesome. That's our whole idea here. And we'll also take a look at a couple of photographers who have sort of set up a system to think about good exposure. And these are sort of classic examples, and I know they're probably not going to apply to every photograph you take ever, but they're a really great place to start thinking about how to stretch your camera's sort of dynamic range, how to get as much out of your camera as possible. So whether you're shooting a camera kind of like the one I'm using in my demonstration, something maybe more like a point and shoot, or even a smartphone, each one of these things is really important to consider. Where does the photographer have control is another good way of thinking about it. So let's get set up for our first photo shoot, and I'll run through that demonstration now. Now, our first photographic project for this week is really going to be sort of like our baseline, right? I want to know, I want you to kind of get a sense for what your camera is capable of, what it's sort of set up to do right out of the box, in other words. And so we're going to shoot pretty simply in full auto, and we're going to set up a mono light studio setup. We're going to allow the image to compress as a JPEG and then bring it into Photoshop for some basic retouching. That image is going to kind of lay the groundwork for everything else we add on to that. So let's put the computers away for a moment and actually get into the studio. I like the idea of being able to make photographs with really basic materials, and so each one of you guys is going to be set up with a simple photographic backdrop. We'll have some of these at school that you can just kind of set up and use when you're at school, but I'm also going to make sure I get one to go home with each one of you too. Simple piece of white butcher paper. It's probably not as thick as it could be for a photographic background, but what it's going to help us do is kind of blow out all the kind of extra junk you've got going on in your studio. Find a good place to pin it up or tape it to the wall. Now, ideally, when this gets pinned up, you'll keep it pretty wrinkle-free, and you'll have it set up in a place where it can be sort of undisturbed for at least a week or so. Now, if yours was rolled up in a cardboard tube like mine, it's going to probably want to walk back on you. So either use a couple of weights to sort of tack this down to the table, or I'm just going to use a bit of tape here. Now, this nice kind of gentle curve that's happening here, we could call that a slip or an infinity background. Essentially what it's going to do is two things, right? It's going to kind of present us with this infinite kind of white space in which we can kind of really just think about, really focus on the lighting. It's also going to kind of cut out a lot of the extra junk that's maybe kind of cluttering up the background of your photographs. For this guy, we're also going to use just a simple 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. You can haul one out of the printer at home, or I'll have some of these waiting for you as well. Now, you may feel really confident doing some sort of, paper sculpture for this, or you may feel really kind of like all thumbs. I've seen really great versions of this assignment with just literally crumpled up piece of paper. But if you want to go to the effort of sort of sculpting something together, the only object you can use to photograph would be a piece of paper. And if you need to hold it together somehow, a little bit of tape or a staple is all you can use. I don't want you guys to introduce any special items, any special objects. We're just going to go pretty simple with this. Now, the other kind of basic item we're going to use is just a simple lamp. It could be something you have at home, or at school we'll be using these kind of simple, like hardware store clip lights. They are really, really simplistic. They generally just have a medium base light bulb. The only thing fancy about this setup, if you can call it that, is that I'm using an LED lamp in the front here, and it has a little bit more of a focused beam to kind of have sort of a spotlighted feel, instead of maybe if you can kind of imagine a lamp at home, one of those classic incandescent light bulbs that throws a little bit more of an ambiance. For just in case any of you guys are curious, about 460 lumens at 4000 K. We'll talk more about some of what that means later on the semester when we talk a bit more about lighting, but honestly, any light source can work. This is not a specialized setup at all. All told, we're probably talking like $5 or $10 worth of materials, and we'll see what we can do with it, right? Now, let's also talk just for a moment about getting your camera set up. I'm going to be shooting a Nikon D600, which is a full-frame DSLR version, probably not unlike a lot of the cameras you've got. I have a 50mm 1.8 lens on the front, which is a prime lens, which means there's no zoom. So some of what you'll see in these kind of early photographs is going to be very similar to yours, but because I have a feeling very few of you are shooting with a prime lens, I'll have the option to do something a bit different here. I'm not going to make this too complicated, though. We're going to keep this as, like I said, our baseline photograph, which means we just have a couple of simple adjustments to make on the camera itself. Now, before we do any shooting at all, either in the studio or out, it's a really good idea to sort of get in the habit of maintaining your equipment. A lens cap can be a very handy way to kind of keep your lens clean, and then you'll also see that on my lens I have a protecting filter on the front. The lens, as it comes from the factory, has no filters on the front, but it has a filter ring. The filter that I put on the front here is like a UVO lens, UVC in this case actually, but it basically means it's a really neutral filter. It basically has no effect on the image itself, and it's just going to protect my lens. Now, the more money you guys end up spending on your lenses, the more likely you will probably want to have something on the front there, just in case you happen to set your lens down or drop your camera. You very likely could damage the lens itself unless you have that filter on the front. Many times I've had students bring their cameras to me and say, "Oh, Mr. Beck, I busted out my lens," and I just unscrew the filter from the front and tell them, "No, you didn't break your lens, you just broke that $10 filter." It's a really handy way to sort of protect the lens. On the most basic level, though, travel with the lens cap, especially if it goes in and out of the bag quite often. The lens cap is just going to protect that lens. Before we get going today, we'll actually haul out our lens cloths, and these are the lens cloths I provided in your art kits. I like these ones. I think they're really nice. I use them both on my camera lenses and on my glasses, but start in the center of your camera lens and kind of work out any oil or dust to the edges. If it's a really, really dusty lens, fight the urge to blow with your breath on that camera. You have a lot of moisture in your breath, especially if you just came from the lunchroom or something, you're going to blow some food onto the lens. I like to use these little small rocket blowers. These ones just happen to be made by Jados, but you can probably get them from any number of manufacturers. They produce a pretty good amount of air, given it's just a small squeeze tube, and prevents you from having to blow on it. And I've had this guy for like 15 years, right? It's not like a can of air that runs out. I really like to use that for both cleaning the inside of my camera and the lens. Now lenses, if you've never taken them off, have a front and a back, so it's not a bad idea to check the back of your lens as well, particularly if you have never done that before. Let's get the camera set up. Now we're going to make just a couple of basic setup adjustments to the camera here before we get shooting. In the menu itself, you're going to be looking for something like your camera shooting menu. And when you scroll through here, just a couple of adjustments that I want you to find. First of all, image quality. Now yours may not look quite like the Nikon arrangement here, but underneath image quality, you'll have a whole bunch of these options to choose from. You see how I've got some JPEG options and some RAW options. Eventually, we'll be shooting in RAW, but for today, I'm going to stick with JPEG. Underneath JPEG, I get to choose the size of that compression. Now, for the sake of what I'm working on today, I'm just going to stick with my large. In general, the way this works is the smaller the files you shoot, the more of your, the more pictures you'll get to fit on that memory card. But in general, as you shrink your file size, you will end up getting lower and lower and lower image quality. Okay. Now there are usually some shortcuts to do this. I have shortcut buttons on the back of my camera here. So if I hold down the quality shortcut and I kind of work my thumb wheel here, I can toggle between fine, medium, and normal. Basic. There we go. Now the last thing I'm going to adjust is I'm going to put my camera in full auto mode. And you know, for these cameras that have a lot of manual control, like in my camera, full auto almost never gets used. On your camera, you may have to go into your shooting menus to find it. It's usually, you know, a bright green, really easy to see version. Now, full auto on this camera isn't going to give me a whole lot of control at all over the image, but that's kind of the point. I want you guys to set up a bit of a baseline for what you guys are capable of doing with these images. The one caveat to that is if as you're starting to shoot this image, if you can't get your if your camera keeps opening the flash. So if I have my lens cap on, for example, my camera senses that it's very, very dark, and it's going to always be popping up this flash. So over and over again, trying to shoot. If you can't get that flash to go down, we'll talk about ways that you can actually switch your camera out of auto so that you can get the photographs you want. But for me, in this case, there will probably be plenty of lighting here in my studio to make this work. So after a few minutes of monkeying around, I got a paper kind of fold that I'm interested in. I'm going to go with kind of a multi-Mobius strip looking thing. And I want to get my first couple of photographs made here. And I want you to work the subject. You've got a pretty willing subject here, just a piece of paper. And I want you to play with a couple of specific things. I want you to work on your lighting. So in this case, you're just going to find find an outlet that's fairly close by. And if you've got a partner, this is really handy, but you're going to use a single light source to light your subject. That means that if you have a lot of ambient lighting going on in the room, you'll dim that down. I'm not going to dim mine down here for the sake of the video, but when you guys are working, I want this light to be your only light source. In other words, your key light should be your only light. I want you to think about working really tight. I want you to kind of back that light off and kind of give it a bit softer light. I want you to go with some different lighting angles. And then I also want you to do some similar work with the camera. So when I say work it, I would say minimum 5 to 10 images will kind of get us in the door. Once you've had an opportunity work the subject a little bit, minimum, 5 to 10 pictures, moving lighting angle, moving the camera angle, kind of real tight lighting, real kind of soft lighting from far back. It's time to get these pictures off your camera onto the computer for a bit of retouching. Now, I'm going to introduce the digital workflow here in a minute, but the very first thing, we've got to overcome for the digital workflow is how to get pictures from your camera, or in other words, the memory card, to your computer. There are a lot of cameras that have, the ability to do wireless transfer. This old thing doesn't do that. I find I'll either have to connect a cable directly from the camera to the computer and initiate a transfer, or I find that actually just pulling the card and then using some sort of card reader isn't too bad. The card reader that I am working with here helps me run on sort of the Mac, right? It plugs into those two USB-C ports. But some computers actually just have a have an SD card slot right into the side. But you're going to need some way to get pictures off the card. If you're really struggling with that, let me know and I'll try to help you out. Now I'm going to pick up with a bit of a Mac specific demonstration here, but it should apply for the most part over to the PC guys in the class as well. You could start by just double clicking on the desktop to see what's on that little thumb drive or what's on that SD card, right? And on my SD card, I have a whole bunch of pictures that are specifically just from this assignment. You notice that in my Finder here, I'm sorting in columns. I find that this is one of the fastest ways to kind of move around inside of the computer. And I don't just mean like I prefer it or that it's organizational, but I actually find that on a Mac, it's like kind of the swiftest way to kind of sift through and organize yourself in the computer. I'm going to leave this window open here, and remember how I said you should have a photography class folder on your desktop? Well, open up that photography class folder as well, and because this unit, I should say, is called the exposure unit, create a new folder inside of that and just name it exposure. This assignment that we're currently working on, we used a single light source, and so we call that the monolight studio shoot. So if you're inside the exposure unit and you're looking to kind of keep yourself organized, I'm going to call this the monolight project. Now I've got a system in place now so that as I'm importing my images, they go right to a home. After shooting 5, 6, 10, 20 assignments, we're really going to fill up with pictures here. And whether you're saving them to your computer desktop or you're saving them to your cloud storage, organization is really important. So I'm just going to select all of my pictures from the shoot today. And the way that I'll do that is hold Shift, I'll click on the top, hold Shift and click on the bottom file. That way I can select all of them. And I'll just drag and drop them right over into my monolight project folder. Now, depending on how big of files these are and how quick your computer is, that may take a long time. If you took 100 pictures for this project, you probably aren't going to need them all. So the next step in this whole process is to sort them, right? If there are any images in here that are obviously trashed, get rid of them. But we're going to keep sort of a working batch here because I'll continue to reference them. And you'll notice that I'm actually going to keep a couple of images in here that are, they're really no good. Like the exposures are pretty bad, but I'll keep them in here anyway, just as references. You guys don't have to keep anything that's that big of an oops. I am going to take my SD card now, drag and drop it over the trash icon, which doesn't delete it, it just ejects it safely, and I'm going to put it right back into my camera. This way I don't forget the next time I need to do a photo assignment for class. I recommend having a dedicated SD card for your camera or dedicated CF card, whatever your camera's shooting. For this class, I don't want you guys to jeopardize accidentally losing family pictures or vacation images or something. It's a really good idea to just have a dedicated card. They're only a couple bucks online if you buy one dedicated for class. That way it's just for this course. I'm also going to teach you guys to get into the habit of formatting your cards fairly regularly. So that's another reason why you don't want to be using the family card. Inside of this batch of photographs here, I'll just do a quick preview, and I do a quick preview on my Mac by tapping spacebar, or I could just look at the small thumbnail off to the side here. You'll notice that I tried out a couple of different kinds of lighting. Lighting that came from behind, lighting that came from the side, and one of the most telltale signs of a monolight photograph is that they're very dramatic. The dramatic lighting comes from a single beam of light, a lot of shadows, and when we retouch these in black and white, you'll see even more so that kind of white paper background slips into this kind of moody gray, dark gray. What you're doing now, though, during this sorting phase is picking which images are worth retouching. Not everything you make is worth saving. Some of it might be worth saving, but definitely not everything you keep is worth retouching. Retouching is sort of like the highest kind of value photograph. So you're going to commit 10, 15 minutes, an hour, 2 hours to one photograph. Nobody has enough time in their life to dedicate that to every image they make. So this process of editing out the images that you won't edit is really important. So kind of sort those through, find one that's worth retouching, and we're going to open that up into Camera Raw. When I launch Photoshop, if you guys remember that I talked about this last time we were editing, that there are ways to sort of launch images directly into Adobe Camera Raw as a global editing software. But if you're not shooting in RAW or you forgot to set your camera to RAW, there are ways to kind of force Photoshop to open even non-RAW files into Adobe Camera Raw to get access to those same kinds of edits. If that was you, if you ended up shooting JPEGs like me, go to File, Open. And as long as you remember your file name, you can kind of go directly there, or you can tap spacebar again and sort of preview which images you were hoping to retouch. Now before you click Open, go ahead and click Format, Camera Raw. This is essentially going to tell Photoshop, hey, open up this .jpeg file into the software, what you're going to see here. Now in Adobe Camera Raw, we've got a couple of things that we can do here that I'm going to consider global edits. Now I'm going to take a quick break for just a second and launch a window here that we can take a look at together. Digital workflow, right? We've already kind of moved partially through this kind of structure to your edits. If you had all the time in the world, you would not need to be organized, but you guys are students, and even if you're not students, right, you end up working as a photographer, you don't have time to be disorganized. So I want to teach you this type of editing sequence to not only speed up your retouching in Photoshop, but also keep you really organized as a photographer. First of all, import and sort images. This is what we did at the beginning of this tutorial session. Select the images to retouch. You may even want to separate those out into a different folder. Open an Adobe Camera Raw. Convert those images to black and white. We're going to do global edits first. Those are edits that affect everything on the whole image. Eventually, we'll talk a little bit about selective edits. We're going to crop. At the very end, we don't crop early. Save out a PSD working copy. PSDs are Photoshop documents and they're lossless files. And then finally, when it comes time to turning your assignments in, we'll save JPEG versions. So what does that look like in practice? Well, we're already opened up in Camera Raw. Let's actually do just a tiny bit of global editing. First off, way up on top here, we're going to switch our color profile from color to monochrome, or another way to say that would be to switching to black and white. Now, as I do my edits here in black and white, I want you to pay attention to a few things. I'm not going to talk too much about sort of philosophies of exposure at this point, but I want you to edit this image in a way that makes sure you maintain details in the highlights and details in the shadows. There are a lot of ways to talk about exposure, and it gets really confusing really fast for new photographers, right? Like the highlights, midtone shadows, too hot, burned out, blown out, pushed, pulled, clipped, missing, opening up, closing down. All that language describes a kind of dance that photographers do as they are editing their images. For today, we're going to limit your edits to just a few, right? We're going to manipulate overall exposure, the overall darkness and lightness of the image. I'm going to bring mine down, overall lightness down, and then bring my highlights up. And you'll notice that I'm making small tweaks here and there to the image, but I haven't completely turned anything into deep dark shadow yet, and I haven't turned anything into completely pure white. Anytime that I'm working in Photoshop doing this kind of work, manipulating exposure, manipulating contrast, I'm going to keep one hand on Command Z. Command Z, remember, is the edit undo option. Up here, I have my basic edits, exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. Now, you could do work in any one of those, but I think the majority of your work will probably be done up here toward the top. One more touch that you can give these images is just a bit of clarity. We'll talk a bit more about how clarity is affecting the images shortly, and then I'm going to open this image up into Photoshop. Once it's in Photoshop, technically I could start to switch over into doing some more selective edits. But in this case, I'm going to do a couple more global edits first. Go to my curves, my curves adjustment layer, and I'm going to add an S-curve. An S-curve in this case is pulling down slightly on the bottom and pulling up slightly on the top. That gentle S-curve is what's called a custom curve here. I could switch my presets to something like a strong contrast, medium, or linear. That just kind of gets me started, and once I would choose one of those, like for example a strong contrast curve, I could always tweak it. But I like to sort of hand mix my own curves. I just sort of feel like after doing this enough times, you start to get a feel for it, and that's sort of where I want you guys to go. I'm not going to overly preach on what exact edits you should do, but I will say that the more you do this type of editing, the better you will get at it. Remember that if you feel like you need to do any more exposure work, you can add a second curves layer and kind of tweak that exposure on the fly. I don't need to do that exposure work, so I'm going to come down here to my layers palette, grab that curve, and throw it away. Now this image is looking pretty close to the point where I'm ready to call it done. The last thing I'm going to do here is add a crop. And this is a pretty good starting place for this image. Essentially, this is full auto on my camera with very little tweaking in Photoshop. I wanted to sort of see where we're at for kind of a good basic retouch. Now that I've got a working copy, which includes at least one adjustment layer here, I'm going to save a working copy. File, Save As. A working copy saved to your computer means that if you ever need to come back to this image and retouch it just a little bit, it's still possible. Format should be JPEG. I'm going to leave the file name the same, and it should automatically save right into that same monolight folder. Click Save. That way, I could potentially finish this up when I get home tonight, or I could come back to school and retouch it a little bit. It gives me the option to sort of pick up where I left off. When it comes time to turning in this file, though, I'm going to do a File, Save As, and save a third version. Save on my computer here. This one I'm going to save out as a JPEG, and I'm going to name it after the assignment. So in this case, this assignment was called Monolight. And I'm going to make sure that I turn in a JPEG version of that final picture. As I'm kind of going through the Save As options, it asks me, do I want to save a medium, low, or high-res JPEG? Go ahead and save the highest possible JPEG quality and click OK. Now, let's go back and take a look just real quick at the end of the tutorial here, how many files that produced, because it could get a little confusing. I have the original file that I took, and this one happens to be in color. I have my PSD working copy, which previews in black and white, but it's more than just the single photograph, right? It has those Photoshop layers. And then finally, when it comes time to turning this thing in, I'll drag and drop this saved JPEG version into my Google portfolio. Guys, that is it for the very first project. I'm really excited to see how you kind of get to work in the studio with some very cheap and fast materials, and I can't wait to hear your questions in Photoshop. I'll catch you up with you in the studio.